So welcome to Julian Forbes-Laird, the fourth time I've interviewed you, Julian, because you fly off the virtual shelf. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Fed,
Good.
fed, fed up a little bit with unintended consequences still, but otherwise I'm well.
Well, we do love an unintended consequence and diving deep into that. And here we go again. So things are changing. So nobody would argue that nature's in crisis. We've got to make things better. And one of the mechanisms for that, one of the things that changes the landscape most of all in the UK is development of whatever form. And
Yes.
so the government have brought in Biodiversity Net Gain. Well, who can argue with developers having to leave things 10% better than they did before by looking at what's there at the moment, by ecologists quantifying that, looking at what's proposed, and then can we make things actually 10% better on site than before the development took place? Sounds almost too good to be true, and in many cases it is. And it came into law in the UK for major developments in February 2024, and for minor developments in April 2024. And everybody's reeling, and it's always the same, isn't it? When something new comes in with the good intention, there are a few snags, and boy, have you found a snag. Julian, thoughts, please.
Yeah, so the way that Biodiversity Net Gain works is it applies to various ranges of habitats. And there are some habitats which are scoped out of Biodiversity Net Gain calculations. And they are the best of all. They are the irreplaceable habitats. And the reason they're scoped out is perfectly sound. It is. Imagine if you have a development that was going to take down, let's say, 5 hectares of ancient woodland, and this would cost you so many biodiversity units. Developers could then simply pay some money and do whatever with that money towards biodiversity and say, there you go, we've replaced the lost biodiversity of the ancient woodland. Well, of course, the thing with an irreplaceable habitat is you can't replace it. The clue is in the name. So to avoid a mathematical approach making it okay to stay with the example, clear fell there of ancient woodland, to avoid that mathematical approach, what they've done is they've created an exception within the regulations for irreplaceable habitat. So in other words, if you're having an adverse impact on ancient woodland, for example, you don't count it within your biodiversity calculations, or biodiversity net gain calculations. That's fine. So what they then have to do is they then have to come up with legislation which defines what this irreplaceable habitat is. And the reason they have to do that is because the rest of the BNG framework is in law, so they have to define the habitats in law. Again, that's perfectly logical. Here, however, is where we have the problem. So let's start with the National Planning Policy Framework. The National Planning Policy Framework provides protection for irreplaceable habitat at paragraph 186C. And it provides, this paragraph, very high protection indeed, and it does so on the basis that what we're looking at is features of exceptional value, whether it's for biodiversity or for cultural or heritage reasons, but exceptional value. And the protection it applies is essentially exceptional as well. According to many interpretations, it's a higher protection for irreplaceable habitat than there is for triple SIs. So that's how high the protection is, really, really high. And examples of irreplaceable habitat that concern me, and my job as a tree consultant, would be ancient woodland and veteran trees. And the way that this works is that if you want to harm ancient woodland, if your development would harm ancient woodland, you have to have or a veteran tree, you have to have a wholly exceptional reason, that's the first test, and a suitable compensation strategy. But you have to have both of those things passed. And this makes sense if you're dealing with very, very high value features. However, in the framework there is a definition for veteran trees. And that definition makes clear that we are dealing with trees of exceptional value. And that's the term it uses, exceptional value. And there have been a number of public inquiries where the definition and the applicability of that definition to veteran trees has been tested. It happens that I have appeared probably in all of them, but certainly almost all of them, if not all of them. And it's been very clear from these inquiries where the bar is set, and the bar is set very high. And this, of course, is reasonable because we're applying exceptional protection. So we must apply that only to the highest value features. The example that I like to give is golden eagles, for example, are subject to exceptional protection in law. Their nests are supervised round the clock until the chicks fledge to make sure people can't steal the eggs, and so on and so forth. You couldn't apply that sort of protection to hedge sparrows, for example, because they're as common as muck. So the exceptional protection is for exceptional value, and the exceptional value resides with exceptional trees. I don't think anybody would really dispute that, or at least you'd hope not. Unfortunately, people do dispute that. There is a section of thought within arboriculture, and it comes perhaps from pressure groups, if you want to use that term, such as the Woodland Trust, that veteran trees can be unexceptional. And what's important about them is, for example, decay and deadwood as features. Well, yes, but you need quite a lot of it, one would have thought, or a complex of features to get you over the high bar of exceptionality, because otherwise every other fourth tree becomes a veteran tree. And
Right.
the public inquiries that I've appeared at over the last few years, time and again I've had objectors, be they local authorities, be they pressure groups, be they members of the public who are using guidance published by pressure groups, arguing that there are more veteran trees present than actually there really properly were. And this debate was finally settled last year in an appeal decision in Brislington Meadows, which, by the way, I was on the losing side for the local authority, where the inspector set really a very high bar indeed. But he set that very high bar on the basis of this test of exceptionality. And it was clear that he was expecting to be impressed to a high standard by the trees, and he just didn't think they were veteran enough to be veteran trees. So whilst setting aside what I might think of his reasoning, which was sound in some areas and perhaps not quite as sound in others, this was where the bar had been set. And what that meant was that large numbers of the supposed veteran trees that would be identified by people using a more broad definition than the framework, they were now clearly not veteran trees. And I think that was about the right place for us to be. It was this that led me to redesign the Raven system into Raven 2 to reflect the inspector's conclusions at Brislington Meadows.
So we have listeners from all around the world, a large contingent in North America and Australia. If people want to find Raven 2, how can they find that?
Yeah, sure. So they will find it on the FLAC website. So that's all the W's, flac.uk.com, and that's FLAC, Foxtrot Lima Alpha Charlie, .uk.com. So they'll find Raven 2 on there, and it's an acronym for Recognition of Ancient, Veteran and Notable Trees. And it's a field guide that you can use to work through to tell you if you're looking at a tree that's ancient in years, veteran or notable, which is a large, impressive tree, but without the features of a veteran tree. Let's look at the national government policy, called the National Planning Policy Framework, for England and Wales, that explains what a veteran tree is in its annex of definitions. A veteran tree is a tree which, because of its age, size and condition, is of exceptional biodiversity, cultural or heritage value. So there are three ingredients: age, it's got to be old relative to other trees of the same species, size, and the inspector of Brislington Meadows wanted to see really big trees for their species, and condition. We're looking at high value habitat, okay, well, very exceptional.
And we're talking
value habitat,
about,
I should say. Yeah.
And we're talking about size relative to species. You made a very good point there.
Yeah, so for example,
It needs
if you're
to be
dealing with
big for species.
Yeah, big for species. If you're looking at a small growing tree species, you can't expect it to be as large as an oak, for example. So it's relative size, relative age, and exceptional biodiversity, cultural or heritage value. So this is the definition that works with the policy in the National Planning Policy Framework. So what's happened now is that they've had to define in law what a veteran tree is, because a veteran tree is an irreplaceable habitat. And you'll recall that I said that they have provided an exception from biodiversity net gain calculations for irreplaceable habitats. And there's a good reason for that. The problem is that whoever wrote the definition for veteran tree either wasn't familiar with the definition in the National Planning Policy Framework, or was familiar with it and wanted to ignore it, and wanted to come up with a completely new definition that has no bearing on the one in the framework.
So,
Yeah.
what's the process of this, Julian? What goes on behind closed doors, do you think, that somebody would say, oh, has anybody else thought of any other definitions?
Yeah.
And somebody say, I don't know. Or
So
they
this
might
is
say, there's one over here. What is the process? And what
So
is
this
the
is
consultation steps?
this is a really good point, but it's more complicated than you might imagine. So before we had the statutory biodiversity net gain, we had it coming out in draft form in a series of iterations with different spreadsheets. You'll be familiar with how it was calculated, and version 3.1 of the biodiversity net gain metric, as it was called, had a recognition system in for veteran trees. It was very simplistic. It didn't include most of the features that us working in this area would recognize for a veteran tree, but it was what was used as a shorthand within the context of biodiversity net gain. So in the Brislington Meadows appeal decision, the consultant acting for the developer had relied on that definition. He'd said, we'll use the one in the biodiversity net gain, different to the National Planning Policy Framework, but we'll use that one. And he said, if you test the trees that Mr. Forbes-Laird says are veterans against that definition, you find that they're not veteran trees. Well, of course, I was using the framework definition, which is the one that previous appeal decisions have said is the correct approach. Anyway, the inquiry closed, and we were waiting for the inspector's appeal decision. Then they brought out Biodiversity Net Gain metric 4.0. And 4.0 removed the way of recognizing veteran trees from the previous version. So there was no longer a government method, if you like, for recognizing veteran trees. And they provided a document summarizing the changes between 3.1 and 4.0. And in this summary of changes document, it said, we've removed the definitions for the recognition for veteran trees so that contemporary methodologies take precedence. Well, there was only one contemporary methodology, and that was Raven. Anyway, somehow the inspector managed to navigate his way back to using the government's withdrawn way of recognizing veteran trees, which was why I was on the losing end of the inquiry. But anyway, that doesn't matter. That's not important. So you already had some guidance from government, which was withdrawn. And you then are left solely with the framework definition. Okay, age, size, condition, exceptional value. Those are the ingredients. So then we have the new regulations published as part of Biodiversity Net Gain, and they're called the Biodiversity Gain Requirements, brackets, Irreplaceable Habitat, close brackets, Regulations 2024. And in these regulations, there is a schedule, and the schedule provides the definition of the various irreplaceable habitats which are being taken out of biodiversity net gain calculation. And we have the definition here of veteran trees, and this is the problem. Now, before I tell you what it is, you asked about the process. I have been told,
Yes.
and I don't know if this is true, I have been told that this definition was drafted by members of Natural England's Specialist Tree and Woodlands team. As I say, I don't know if that's right, but that's what I've been told, and I was told by somebody working in the relevant government department. So maybe they made a mistake, maybe it's right, I don't know. But let's say it's been drafted by Natural England's Specialist Tree and Woodland team. They will be acutely well aware of what the definition for veteran trees is in the National Planning Policy Framework. But that Specialist Tree and Woodland team, unfortunately, have form. They have form for using in their guidance a definition which is different to the framework's definition. So if you look up the standing advice published by Natural England and the Forestry Commission, it will tell you that a veteran tree may not be very old, I'm reading, by the way, from this, but it has significant decay features such as branch death and hollowing. These features contribute to its exceptional biodiversity, cultural and heritage value. Well, that's a long way for age, size and condition. Just branch death and hollowing. So are we saying that trees with a few dead branches and a cavity are now veteran trees? Is that really what we're saying? And it's
Hang on a minute.
I like that.
Well, let's just those of you who are arboriculturalists, think of your last tree survey. Maybe you looked at a dozen trees, maybe you looked at 60 in one day. How many of those trees did you recall dead branches, major deadwood? But they may just have been a urban line of sycamore and lime and beech next to a footpath. Yeah. They may be 60 years old. Well, you'd probably see a few dead branches, wouldn't you? You might see a few cavities. Maybe they've lost a branch. Maybe there's been horrible flush cuts or some bad pruning and it's created a cavity in the tree. These trees, in a park, let's say they're 60 years old. They've almost certainly, in that survey, you may have identified half of them with those features. Are we saying, Julian, that half of those trees are now classified as veteran under the Biodiversity Net Gain?
It's unfortunately worse than that. So I'm just going to
love you on the podcast.
I'm just going to go to the definition. Now, I'm not concentrating today talking about ancient trees because the definition for those is sound, and it's basically the same as the framework. It basically means the oldest subset of veteran trees. So we all know what an ancient tree is. So what we're looking at is the class down, if you like, in value, although they have the same status in planning. There's clearly a step change in value between a veteran and an ancient tree. So we're talking about just the veteran trees. So what I was quoting from before was the standing advice published by Natural England and the Forestry Commission, which uses a looser definition than that found in the framework. But it gives an indication as to what the people who I understand were behind these regulations consider to be a veteran tree. And it's trees which have features which are frankly commonplace. And this is where the problem arises. So we're just going to look at the definition now, and I'm just going to look away so I can read this definition rather than go through a screen sharing thing. I'm just going to do it to one side. So veteran trees are mature trees. So mature is the gateway feature. So that's okay. You'd want a tree to be at least mature. So veteran trees are mature trees that share physical or other characteristics in common with ancient trees. Okay, so far. Due to their life or environment, but are neither developmentally nor chronologically ancient. No one's going to disagree with that. That's perfectly fine. We're all friends at this point. Okay. It then says veteran trees exhibit one or more of the following features. So they can qualify as a single criterion. One or more of the following features. Number one, significant decay features such as deadwood, hollowing, or signs of advanced decay in the trunk or major limbs. So hollowing, okay. Signs of advanced decay in trunk or major limbs, yeah, okay. But deadwood? That starts to bring in very, very large numbers of trees. So that's part one, or criterion one. Criterion two is a large girth depending on and relative to species, site, and management history. So you could have a tree with no habitat features at all that now qualifies just because it's fat. Really? Is that a veteran tree? Is that tree of exceptional value?
No,
I don't think so.
It could just be some of us, it could just be its genetic makeup, its
just be a big tree. So now,
it's a big tree in a fat, juicy environment. Got everything it needs. I'm going to grow, man.
Yeah,
but it could be something. It could just be a Lane cypress.
Yeah, probably turkey oak.
Or
a big turkey oak without
maple.
the slightest trace of habitat feature is now apparently a veteran tree, an exceptional tree. Really? Is that so? I don't think it is.
No.
And then the final,
No.
and this for me is the real killer actually. The final criterion, part 3, trees which have a high value for nature. Well, we all love high value for nature, don't we? But how is high value for nature the same as exceptional value? Nobody confuses high and exceptional in ordinary language. So high value for nature, especially in hosting rare or specialist fungi, lichens and deadwood invertebrates. Well, I agree. If you've got specialist or rare cohabiting species, yes, that does start to become impressive, but they set the bar at high, whereas the framework sets the bar at exceptional. And so here we have two problems. One is you're going to have many, many, many more trees being said to be veterans by people objecting to development, which is going to cause a very significant problem. The second thing is you now have what in legal terms is called a lacuna, a gap. The gap lies between trees which are veterans under the National Planning Policy Framework, which are trees of exceptional value, and trees which are veterans under the regulations, which are of high value. And the reason that this matters is imagine if you have a veteran tree classified under the framework and the developer wants to take it down to build a roundabout for the sake of argument. They have to demonstrate wholly exceptional reasons and provide suitable compensation. That tree is assessed within the planning system, and there is a consequence if you want to remove that tree. And the consequence is, chances are you're not going to get a planning permission to do so. That's fine. Meanwhile, if you have a veteran tree under the regulations that doesn't get captured by the National Planning Policy Framework, your regulations veteran tree isn't part of your biodiversity net gain calculation. So you can propose that tree for removal, and it doesn't get counted in the minus column of your BNG metric, but it doesn't get counted within the National Planning Policy Framework because it's not of exceptional value. So you have trees which are now falling between the two systems, unless or until the High Court decides that if a tree qualifies under the regulations, it qualifies under the framework even though it doesn't match the definition in the framework. But the problem with that is that the regulations don't amend and don't seek to amend the National Planning Policy Framework. So they've got these two parallel systems that don't cover the same trees. It's madness.
Wow. And so it is madness. And there are many, many consequences I can think of. Again, listeners, I take you back, for those whose tree survey, to your last survey and what you saw. And again, think about how did you classify the age class of those trees, given your experience and qualifications and your normal practice. And having heard this, wherever you are in the world, how might you have reclassified the age class of those trees? And how does that feel in your gut? So that's the first one, but this enormous potential, I say erroneous classification of trees based on if you just need to meet one of those three features. So let's go through those again for the listeners. Deadwood and cavity, big fat tree.
Yeah, so significant decay features.
High nature. Yeah, and
high value
high
for
nature
nature,
value, not
yeah.
High value.
Not
so
exceptional.
again, there are various things that you can say. Well, this particular lichen, fungus, violet click beetle, invertebrate, etc. It's known to be a specialist on veteran trees, and then you think there is some scientific backup for that, and that I don't have a problem with. But I can see how this could be interpreted by well-meaning, good-intended, non-arboriculturalists go, well, it's got blue tits, it's got, tree creepers, it's got this, that, and the other. All of that, of course, it's valuable. But
but there's a difference between
the other way.
This difference in the scale of the value. Sorry, the proportionality to the protection.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. There is something else too, isn't there, Julian? As well, let's say then that whereas on a site under the National Planning Policy Framework definition of veteran trees, let's say there are 80 trees on this development site potential, and 2 of them are identified as veteran trees. Now, if you choose to carry out your survey and use your classification under the regulation veteran trees, you may end up with 30. Let's just say you do. Now, some of those 30 trees might be classified under the British Standard trees in relation to Design, Demolition and Construction Recommendations 2012. You may then find that many of those 30 trees might be category U. That means they're unsuitable for retention in terms of development, and
Yes,
they
exactly.
may be nearly dead. They may have great big splits on the trunk. They may be structurally compromised, but they may not be large. They may not be old for species. They may not have particular notable identifiable habitat. So then you've got that conflict, but there's also something else, isn't there, Julian, about the size of the root protection area. So if we've got these additional trees identified as veterans under the regulations, by the way, not by the agriculturalist, but by the ecologist, which is something else I need to say, because you could have the agriculturalist working under the National Policy Planning Framework definition, and it's the ecologist who's going around doing the biodiversity net gain calculations and the preliminary ecological assessment, identifying these as veteran trees. So who do we listen to? And then the root protection areas are different. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think in reality is that arboriculturists will still keep control of the identification process. It's just that there's quite a lot of arboriculturists who are of a mindset that would chime in full agreement with these regulations and say the trees are veterans, which really don't meet the threshold set by the framework. And I've been on the other side of a number of them in public inquiries. And I have one of the guys that works with me. He went on a veteran tree course run by a well-known industry body in this country, and he said he spent the whole day arguing because they were trying to tell him things were veteran trees, which were absolutely not, and very much in line with your example of a line of urban sycamores with a cavity at the base and a couple of dead branches. And the reason this matters is we come back to is the proportionality of the policy, which is a very high level of protection, and it must protect only the exceptional, because otherwise it devalues the whole system.
Yes, exactly. That's the point, isn't it? That we're not saying we don't think these trees are valuable that might fall under the regulations. We're not saying who cares about those. Just to be clear to the listener, what we're saying is for things to really stick, they have to be absolutely credible and powerful.
Yes, they do. Yeah, they
Otherwise,
do.
if everything gets diluted, you lose the value of what is truly exceptional because it all goes in the same mushy pile. So,
yes, exactly.
No.
Yes, exactly. And to give you an example, we've been going over our data sets for live sites at the moment, trying to identify the need, whether they have a need to go and revisit some trees which were not formerly veterans to see whether they might fall under the regulations. And there's one site I looked at just this morning, population of 400 and something trees on the site, 2 veteran trees under the framework definition identified using Raven 2. We need to go and check 120.
Yeah.
That's getting on
that's a
for
lot.
25% of the stock. It's absolutely crazy. So
well, let's talk about the consequences of that to land use planning.
Yeah, so this brings us to this question of root protection areas. Exactly. So the root protection area at the moment under BS 5837 2012 is 12 times the diameter of the stem. This is then expanded upon literally by Natural England and the Forestry Commission standing advice that I mentioned earlier to say that a buffer zone around veteran trees should be provided of 15 times the stem diameter. That's okay, we can work with that. That's an understandable constraint. It's not particularly excessive. But if you have a tree, let's imagine a pedunculate oak. This thing's 400 years old. It's got a 2-meter diameter stem. Okay? 15 times that is 30 meters. So that's the radius of the buffer zone. So it's a 30-meter radius buffer zone. This is a big slab of real estate that's become sanitized from development. Fair enough, you say. It's fine. It's a 400-year-old tree. It's exceptional value. That's all fine. But then imagine that you've suddenly got dozens of other veteran trees on the site, all with a 15 times stem diameter buffer zone trees, which you cannot propose for removal because you don't have a wholly exceptional reason. Suddenly, the constraint on development becomes excessive. And what happens when that occurs? What happens when that occurs is that one weekend, the local residents wake up to the sound of chainsaws as trees are being felled. Before a tree preservation order can be put on them, before the planning application has gone in. And which trees are they going to fell first, Sharon? They're going to fell the biggest ones with the biggest constraints. So the unintended consequence of this nightmare definition is we are going to see preemptive felling of our oldest, biggest and best trees because constraint has become excessive.
I love the way you described that terrifying scenario. I want to go back a few steps in time where we talked about the larger root protection area, which is proposed by the Ancient Tree Forum, that basically are older trees, our veteran trees and our ancient trees, because they're in the latter stage of life, require a larger rooting area to be undisturbed because of the complex relationships underground with mycorrhizae, fungi, etc., and their limited resources for change. I really agree with that. In fact, I have scanned a lot of our ancient and veteran trees, including the major oak, to assess the extent of their root protection area, and only then looking at roots with a diameter thicker than your thumb. So of course there's a myriad of fine feeder roots beyond that which are not measurable and are critically important. And I have found that they're rooting even beyond the 15 times stem diameter. So I think there's a real importance to this. But when we are over categorising veteran trees and by therefore creating these larger root protection areas, the fact is, like it or lump it, land use needs to change. We do have a housing crisis. And so if we are blocking off huge areas of development on a, let's imagine a 3 hectare square field, let's just do that in our heads, with 80 trees around the edge and some in the middle. If say 30% of those are now classified as veterans, it makes a far smaller developable area, which leads to, I mean, even if there are enlightened developers around, they want to do the right thing, etc., etc., and they see that area as being an opportunity for informal sort of nature conservation area, part of Biodiversity Net Gain, etc., etc. But if they're scattered, which they generally are, you've got a far smaller developable area. So what is the cost of that? I'll tell you what I think the cost of that is. Not such a nice place to live, and when you buy the house, who is bearing the cost? The householder. Because land value becomes far more expensive. We already have a problem in the UK where it's really hard for young people, if not impossible, to buy their first home now. So surely that's going to get worse. And so we've got very high value housing in a smaller area for perhaps what some regulation says is a veteran tree, but really it's just a bit of a tired sycamore that's been mullered in the past, etc., etc.
Exactly.
So I think this deserves a great deal of thought because we must protect the right trees.
Well, you see, this is the thing. This is the great irony. And if you want to have a great laugh at the practical joke that the system has played on us, you can turn to the explanatory note tucked away at the bottom of the regulations that says that a regulatory impact assessment has not been published for these regulations because it's not expected that they will have a financial impact on the private or voluntary sectors. So they didn't even do a regulatory
impact.
I know. They didn't even do a regulatory impact assessment. They've just pumped these things out and said, there you go, deal with it.
Okay,
no consultation, no scrutiny.
I want to speak to that more if I may. So you and I both work as tree consultants within the development industry. I appreciate you do other things as well. I don't. And Biodiversity Net Gain, I go right back to the beginning of the podcast. This is a good thing. We
Yeah.
love nature. We've got to make things better, and we need a dirty great stick to do it. Let's be honest. But what's happening is where 10% gain can't be achieved on a development site because the local authority will have allocated that site in its development plan for X number of units. But in order to achieve those units, and no, the local authority doesn't want flats in the countryside, it wants houses with gardens, quite right too, then everything is very squeezed. So then we're looking at the developer paying for, in simple terms, off-site to a site, a receptor site, where they can pay for biodiversity net gain credits where they can't achieve it on site. Now the presumption is, and the intention is, that it will always be achieved within that development site boundary, but where it can't because of density requirements, it's paid off site. There is a financial consequence to that.
Yes.
I know that people listening might think, well, developer doesn't make enough money, it doesn't, it comes out of their pocket, so what? Who cares about the developer and who cares about their profit? Well, the reality is that's passed on, isn't it?
Yes, it is passed on. It is passed on. All these things come back to the same place in the end, and the irony we're potentially facing as we go to the polls on election day, when I'm recording this with you, Sharon, is we could have regime change. We could have regime change that amends the national planning policy framework to maximise house building, to maximise onshore wind and solar, all of which require land. In the meantime, the same framework could amend the definition for veteran trees to match the regulations to close the lacuna we spoke of earlier, and therefore creating many more impediments to development just when they're trying to increase development. So there's a certain be careful what you wish for here in terms of protecting very, very many trees as veterans, which nobody really sensibly would say were of exceptional value. But that's what it looks like is happening at the moment.
Well, I mean, yes, just to say, listeners, this is a day of the election in the UK, and if things are to be believed, we're having a change of government after many years. And one of the things that the Labour Party have said is they will be very quickly issuing a new national planning policy framework. So we'll be waiting to see about that. But I tell you what, Julian, I've also observed something else to do with biodiversity net gain. And I know that I'm moaning, and basically I think it's a fabulous thing, and I want nature. But I'll give you an example whereby a 3 hectare field, pretty much, I did the tree survey, all the trees were around the edge, and they're all being retained, which is brilliant. And the developers listened, and we've adjusted the layout, and this is what I want. I want all the trees retained in an ideal world, and I want loads of trees planted, and it's all marvellous. But some of those trees on the edges, which will end up being in very small rear gardens, are 11-metre tall dead elms. No way, they're category U. Those dead elms pose a hazard. They might fall. They're as tall as the garden is long. I want those trees out. That's my recommendation.
Yeah.
And the developer said, oh no, we can't take those trees out because the local authority doesn't want any tree loss for ecology, and the ecologists counted those to remain. I said, I put my foot down. I said, I will not write a report that retains 11-metre high dead elm trees in somebody's rear garden. And this is not the only people at the table here. We've got to consider health and safety, and then we can plant something new.
Yeah, sure, of course. And let's bear in mind that under some guidance, standing deadwood over 200 millimetres is valuable for biodiversity. There's one part of the definition I didn't read you because I was saving that. I'll now go back to it. Are you ready? Veteran trees which have died are still recognised as such because they retain significant biodiversity value for many decades. So we now have dead trees being counted within, supposedly, paragraph 186C of the framework, and still requiring a 15-time stem diameter offset from development. Meanwhile, there's no statutory protection you can apply for those trees. So what are the developers going to do, do you think? They're going to take down all the dead trees. And if you've got a tree that qualifies as a veteran because it has dead branches, what will happen to those dead branches? They're going to be taken off. So here we go. Just when agriculturists have spent decades pressing for deadwood retention where safe to do so, they've come up with regulations that now strongly incentivize deadwood removal and sanitation felling of dead trees. You can't make this stuff up. Unfortunately, somebody has done.
So, whilst I raise my jaw to talk again from its position of falling to my chest, let's look at that. So there are no regulations at all in the UK which would stop anybody from felling a dead tree unless it had a protected species such as a bat.
Yeah.
Or some other rare sort of red data list.
Yeah.
There are no regulations in the UK, nor should there be, unless there is a bat, from taking out dead wood. So they can't really enforce this preemptive deadwood removal, but the opposite of what we're trying to do is to keep all this gorgeous deadwood in its many different forms of standing, hanging, on the ground, damp in water, all of that stuff that we love the variety of, which just potentially could go if the developers are organised enough. And
it's not even the developers though, is it? Because if I do a tree survey now and I identify a dead veteran tree and I put a 15 times buffer zone circle around it on my CAD plan, and I say to the clients, if you choose to retain that tree as part of your layout, you'll have to have this huge offset. And they'll say, well, has it got a tree preservation order on? I say, well, it did have when it was alive, but it's a dead tree now, and the TPA doesn't protect dead trees. So the client says, well, nothing to stop me felling then, is it? No, there isn't. What are they going to do?
Of course.
They're going to fell that tree. Yeah. It's a shocker. It's an absolute shocker. So this is actually going to lead to significant loss of habitat, significant reduction in biodiversity due to preemptive deadwood removal or dead tree felling, or in the worst case, felling of live trees which are unprotected in case they're veterans.
We do have the felling license. We do have the felling license regulations.
Yep.
Which prevent the felling of 5 cubic meters or more in a calendar quarter in non-residential settings. There are other exemptions, but so that would protect, say, a handful or one big tree, or several sort of medium-sized trees. Anything more than that, you're going to be in breach of felling license. We know that the Forestry Commission in the UK, Forestry Authority, is woefully understaffed and under great pressure to really just achieve their day job.
You're not going to find any sympathy from me. You won't find any sympathy from me for the Forestry Commission.
I appreciate that. I'm not asking for that, but I'm stating a commonly widely understood fact is that they have limited resources, okay? So there could be breach of felling licenses. There are no regulations which prevent trees from being pruned unless they were within a conservation area or protected by a tree preservation order, or have a protected bat in them. So there's nothing to stop them from doing that. But do you really think that this is going to change things in that negative way? I mean, you've looked at it analytically, and thank you for that. But do you think in practice that developers will be advised by their team, maybe their viability team, to do this?
I think certainly in respect of deadwood and dead trees,
I don't see it often.
Yeah. No, I don't,
Okay.
and I wouldn't, I don't get involved with that. But I think certainly in relation to dead trees or trees which qualify as veterans for no other reason than dead branches, I think we will see those things being targeted. I'd be very surprised if we didn't. But in terms of preemptive felling of live trees, I hope not, but it does go on, and you do see it in the news all too often. This is the sort of thing that makes that more likely. It's the concept actually of the more you tighten a regulatory grip, the more the thing you're trying to grip slips through the fingers.
So what would you propose would be the best way forward? If you had the power to change the regulations, what would you do?
So what I would have done is I would have framed the definition for veteran trees to match the framework, because the one in the framework is proportionate to the protective policy. So
Yes.
if they want to now say there are many more trees as veterans, then they need to water down the policy. But if the policy is going to remain as strong as it is, then it needs to only apply out of a sense of proportionality to the top echelon of trees in terms of biodiversity value. Hence the use of the term exceptional to describe that value, rather than the term high value, which is what you have in the regulations. My worry is they will just simply change the definition in the framework to water it down, so you end up with many more relatively ordinary trees being given exceptional protection. And I think that tilts the balance too far the other way.
Thank you for that. I think also there is a tension at the moment. This is a new piece of legislation in the UK. We're all finding our feet. Ecologists have become the most important people in the room at a meeting. And I feel for them, because many ecologists who are fantastic people went into industry for a love of bats, dormouse, orchids, a love of the natural world. And they find themselves in front of a spreadsheet and they're under enormous pressure. And I wonder if they're all feeling great job satisfaction right now. I wonder.
Who knows?
And,
Who knows?
And also I have noticed a tension between, as I spoke about earlier, U category trees under the British standard and posing a risk to health and safety, or simply just taking up space where you could put something new.
Yeah, sure.
We are trained and foresters to look to the future. And I hope that whilst we must respect our exceptional trees and keep as many trees as we reasonably can on a development site, this land is also entering a new era, a time of change. And let's also define that with good structural landscaping with new trees. We don't have to keep looking just at how things are. We need to protect the things of highest value, high landscape and ecological and cultural value, and add to it. So
yes, well,
my worry is
indeed
also
we do.
that. Yes, my worry is also that if we're over categorising trees as veterans as the regulation requires us to, are we losing space for something new and something that might also cope better for climate change and add biodiversity? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think there is always a balance between existing and proposed trees, and if you have trees in one particular setting, it doesn't mean at all that they're going to be suitable for the change in land use that is proposed as part of development. And it's very often the case that if you're looking at a non-designed landscape with just self-set trees in it, that those trees are actually emphatically not going to be what you'd want in your designed landscape. And you are much better replacing them. And good quality planting schemes will almost always be better in housing schemes than what nature happens to have left scattered around the place randomly. It's almost invariably the case in terms of species, if nothing else, because many of our native trees are particularly unsuited for an urban environment, and you wouldn't necessarily want to keep them. And that emphasis on nativeness in the BNG calculations, I think, does landscape design a considerable disservice, actually, because what you want as part of development is you want trees which are optimized to what you're providing, not necessarily trees that you happen to already have. Maybe you want those as well, but there is a decision to be taken there. But you're right very much to take this to a sort of what can we do looking forward point of view. My view of these regulations, hideous though they are, is they're literally the law. So regardless if we like them or not, that's no longer relevant. It's a question of what we have to work with. And so since I started grappling with these properly a few weeks ago, I have been devising a protocol for how to identify veteran trees in the field according to the regulatory definition, What then happens with that information and how that is fed into the planning decision-making process, given it doesn't match the framework, as we've said already, given this lacuna, is a separate question. But I have got it worked out now. I have got it figured out. I'm not calling it Raven 3. I haven't even got a name for the thing that I've designed. But the idea will be that anybody picking this up can use it to identify trees that would meet the criteria with the regulations. And it's a process. It's not a one-off, because you will need a lichenologist if there are grounds for thinking that there's high-value lichen present, and you will need a fungi survey if there's grounds thinking there's high-value fungi present as well. So it's a process that goes far beyond just a single site visit tree survey. It becomes much more like an ecology process with a survey window in the case of the fungi, which for anybody listening who's interested is going to be August to October, to capture the relevant species, and I can come back to that in a minute. But so yeah, we're coming up with a process now that people can use to say, okay, we've got to work with these regulations. They're literally the law. So how do we identify veteran trees? And I'm attempting to answer. Well, I believe I have got that answer available.
This sounds fascinating, Julian. How can people find out more?
So I've been thinking about what the best way of releasing this into the wild is. And I'm going to not do what I normally do and just turn it loose straight away. I'm going to sit on it for a few months. I'm going to subject it to field use to make sure it does work the way that I believe it will work. And then I'm going to launch it formally at the FLAC, the seminar 2024 at Morley Hayes in Derbyshire, 5th to 7th of November. This was a seminar that we were planning anyway. It's the same framework, as it were, that we had last year in the New Forest, and the title of the seminar is Fungi and Veteran Trees in the Planning System. And guess what? It looks like I'm in the right place at the right time with the right subject matter to cover precisely this question and others as well. So that's where I'm going to be launching the new system. So people coming along to that will get first sight of it outside FLAG.
And this can be for international people as well. It doesn't have to be UK based. So if some of our listeners from the States want to come along, they'll be very welcome. And I've heard great things. In fact, I think I might try and go to that as well. Julian, it's been awesome, fascinating. And I just thank you for your really razor sharp mind, where you dissect things that the rest of us go, brilliant.
Sure you don't.
So I thank you, and I'm so looking forward to seeing you speak at the Cultural Association Conference in September, when you're on the second day, last slot. Tell us briefly the subject of your presentation.
So the title of the talk is Trees and Decay Fungi, a New Approach. And in this I draw together a number of different threads of perhaps slightly obscure information to provide a new protocol for understanding decayed trees based on, well, things you'll have to come to the lecture to find out. But unfortunately, the AA only gives me 20 minutes, but the full lecture is at our seminar in November, but you'll hear a summary in 20 minutes in September if you come to the AA conference.
Well, listen, aside from your conference, I always recommend the AA conference. Every year, it's just so much fun meeting old friends and making new friends and hearing from people around the world. They put on a good show. So, hey, AA, go onto the website and also book your conference place. They've still got their early bird, I think, till the end of July. I've booked today. So, Julian Forbes-Laird, thank you so much for your time. You've been amazing.
You're most welcome. No doubt we'll do this again.